Hello, friends, and welcome back to my course. The prayer of the Apostle Paul is the very first text in the Nag Hammadi library. It wasn't written by Paul, but by someone who viewed Paul as an apostle and who venerated him and was prepared to write a very rich invocation, even if the technical terms and background story of the prayer may be unfamiliar to you. I encourage all of you now, if you haven't already, stop the video and go read the prayer for yourself, and, if you're so inclined, actually pray it. Because faith, which is simply a disposition toward openness, will greatly aid you in understanding. As will become our custom, we will start off with an excerpt from the Nag Hammadi text. Here, using my own translation, quote, "Save my soul of light with my spirit forever, and reveal to my divine consciousness the firstborn of the fullness of grace. May you bestow what eye of angel has not yet seen, what ear of archon has not yet heard, and what has not yet arisen in human hearts, humans who have become angels. Humans who are molded in the beginning in accordance with the animate God." Now, although this is the first text in Codex 1, it was probably the last text to be added there, since technically there was no room for it, and the scribe who wrote the tripartite tractate, the last tractate of this codex, had to add the prayer to the inside front cover or flyleaf. In other words, Codex 1 was planned to have the Secret Book of James, then the Gospel of Truth, then a 7-page space was left for the Treatise on Resurrection, and finally the long tractate, the tripartite tractate, was added. The Gospel of Truth and the tripartite tractate have a Valentinian flavor, and some have argued, I think rightly, that the prayer of Paul is Valentinian, or at least Valentinian in origin. The scribe who placed the prayer in the codex didn't think that there was some conflict between Paul and James, since they now sit so tightly and comfortably together, though Paul may have a certain authority. Of course, we're dealing here with the Gnostic Paul and the Gnostic James. When the apostles are understood in a Gnostic way, they are not in conflict. The prayer might not have started out its life being called the prayer of the Apostle Paul. When this attribution was made, we don't know, but the I who speaks the prayer is unclear, in part because the first 2 lines of the prayer have been lost due to decay. It suffices for the reader to identify with the I speaking the prayer. The scribe who copied the prayer was very pious, because at the end of the prayer, he not only says that this is the prayer of the Apostle Paul, but he says that he wrote or speaks the prayer in peace and irene, and that Christ is holy, here using a Christogram. So we've got obviously a Christian scribe, a Christian who inscribes the first selection of a Gnostic library. He was probably a monk, and he decorated the end of the text with 2 types of crosses and referred to Christ using the Chi Rho symbol. By praying the prayer of Paul, all the contents of the codex are read in a state of devotion, which should be a state that we attempt to foster as we proceed to read these truly sacred texts. The texts are put under the patronage, as it were, of the Apostle Paul, who truly did ascend past an angel of Satan to hear unspeakable mysteries in the 3rd heaven, according to 2 Corinthians 12. Paul might even be called the patron saint and inspiration of the whole Nag Hammadi library, and he was certainly an inspiration for Valentinus. Now, the prayer is called the prayer of Paul, but it was originally a prayer invoking Paul, probably, because the person who wrote the prayer at one point petitions God through the evangelist. And the best known evangelist, at least among Christians, is Paul. but the evangelist or bringer of good news might also refer to Jesus. The prayer initially identifies God in 4 ways with 4 general petitions, and then the prayer follows with 4 more specific petitions for 1. Authority, 2. Bodily health, 3. Salvation for the eternal light, soul, and spirit, which are probably distinguished, and finally for divine revelation, specifically regarding the firstborn of the fullness of grace. The author constructs the prayer by using and adapting Pauline phrases, such as the name above every name, coming from Philippians 2, and granting what no eye or ear has experienced, from 1 Corinthians 2:9. And the language of fullness or pleroma might also come from Colossians, at least originally. We have a series of Valentinian themes, which is just part of the Pauline reception, or the reception of Paul in the 2nd century. The reference to the eternal light soul is probably a reference to what Valentinus himself referred to as the seed of superior reality. That is, that spiritual part of ourselves, the deathless and true self inserted into us after the creation of our mortal body. But this idea of a divine spark is, of course, not specifically Valentinian, nor is the language of pleroma or fullness. The firstborn of the fullness in Valentinian theology, if we want to read it that way, could be read as the final product of the fullness after the lower wisdom is expelled from the divine realm. And this part of the fullness is named Jesus, who is also mentioned in the prayer as King of the Aeons, and in Valentinian theology as Savior of fallen wisdom. The archons mentioned in the prayer are probably lower angelic beings and assistants to the Creator who hinder the progress of the human soul. The animate God, sometimes translated as psychic God or God of soul, refers to the Creator, and soul is his substance. The Creator made our corruptible soul and our flesh suit in his own likeness. So we have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, but the Creator has no access to our spirit. Human salvation in Valentinian thought does mean becoming an angel, and specifically by marrying our angelic bridegroom, who is our spiritual twin. As for Hermetic themes in the prayer, it's interesting that this prayer addresses God as the nous, or divine consciousness of the suppliant. This is a deeply Hermetic idea, the idea that God is nous and is our nous. We find it in Corpus Hermeticum 1, the Poimandres, and in 11, a tractate in which divine consciousness speaks directly to Hermes thrice great. The person praying the prayer doesn't view himself or herself as alienated from the divine. He or she prays to and through the divine consciousness, which is already God on some level. God, in short, is the greater spirit of which the human spirit is a part. And so one is, in a sense, praying not to someone else, but to one's higher self. In Corpus Hermeticum 13, section 17, God is called the mind's eye, which has some resonance with the prayer here. The fact that God is greater than any name is common knowledge. We have the name above all names from Philippians, but the idea of a God beyond name is standard in Hermetic and Platonic philosophy. The idea of rest also shows up in the Hermetica. Of course, it's a Valentinian theme, but it's also a very common theme among many different kinds of ancient spiritual writings, including Hermetic writings. If the prayer was inspired by Valentinian ideas, or at least by Valentinian language, it was written after Valentinus and probably after 2nd generation Valentinians, who concentrated, it seems, in Alexandria and Rome. Technically, the prayer could have been written anywhere in the Roman Empire where Valentinian thought existed, but due to the Hermetic connections at the same time, it seems that Egypt is the best candidate for provenance, since in Egypt Hermetic thought and themes flourished the most. Hermetism can be thought of as the kind of sister or sibling of Christianity in the early centuries of the Common Era. In terms of date, the author of the prayer clearly knows the Gospel of John because he or she refers to the Paraclete or Advocate of Truth, who is also the Spirit. That's in the Farewell Discourse of John, chapters 14 and 16. The author probably knew a Pauline letter collection since he or she refers to at least 2 Pauline letters, probably 3. Maybe there are allusions to more letters. And the prayer ends with a formal doxology, versions of which are actually still spoken today in many churches. Yours is the power, the glory, the praise, and greatness forever. This ending is so formalized, it might even be a later 4th century addition. But if the whole prayer was written at one time and has been preserved, this doxology would still suggest a later date, maybe 3rd or early 4th century. The prayer may have been modified throughout time, but its main body could be as early as the 2nd century, probably mid to late 2nd century. We don't know the original context of the prayer or the place where the scribe excerpted it. What we do know is that the scribe of this codex found or remembered this prayer after finishing the codex and was apparently moved by it. And in his piety toward Paul, he placed the prayer first in the collection, first in this codex, and it has stood ever since as the gateway to the Nag Hammadi library. Emotionally then, whether or not we understand everything in the prayer, it sets the tone and vibe of the whole library, and it strums the chords of our own emotions, tuning us and training us how we ought to read the library. It is to be read with prayer. The Nag Hammadi writings are sacred texts, which can only be rightly understood with a heart devoted to seeing unseen mysteries, a heart which is open to receiving these mysteries by grace. Even if we don't believe in a traditional God, we can still speak with our voice into a fullness with our consciousness sanctified by good expectations and goodwill. Only in this state can we receive the deeper spiritual truths. So I encourage you, read this prayer slowly and in a state of meditation. If you find yourself wanting to read too fast, come learn Coptic with me, which will definitely slow you down and train your minds to focus on each individual word. I know that a lot of modern people have had problems with Paul. If you never liked Paul, that's fine. Just realize that the Paul in this prayer is a Paul transformed and redefined. This is not the Orthodox Paul, the authoritarian and occasional hothead being sarcastic in Corinthians and yelling in Galatians and pontificating in the pastorals. This is the angelified and Gnostic Paul. So don't let one particular stream in the history of interpretation get in the way of your spiritual journey. However you want to understand this particular prayer, keep in mind that the authoritarian Paul wasn't the first version to exist, and it won't be the last.